Greetings, this is the Question GM. So this is for day 3 of RPGADay 2020, and the topic for today is going to be threat. This is a topic that caught me a little bit off guard because the only thing I can really think about when it comes to threat, and it's definitely not a forums threat, which is was a really old method of communication back in the early days of the internet, especially in the RPG internet. What comes naturally to me is actually when we're talking about a plot thread or a narrative thread. If you did a little bit of literary studies, there is this concept of thread that when a character has a backstory or a presence in a novel or any narrative piece, I would say any narrative, they are forming a type of thread, and it's naturally the idea is to progress through every character's thread. It could be a plot thread, it could be a character thread. The story is supposed to move along those lines, so to speak, and reaching its final conclusion. That's where the design part comes into, whether you're a novel writer or video game designer or, eventually a game master. So the idea of having threats in your game, having a threat in your campaigns or adventures or whatever you want to call them, there's a concept that I think we probably are familiar with at some point. Just that we don't really have a real name for it, or we just don't realize what is it exactly. And it is something that I think, especially when it comes to the medium of role playing games, and maybe to the extent of video games. But it comes to it, to me, I feel threats, plot threads at least, can come from different places. It can come from a player playing a character. It can come from a DM trying to run a story with that icky meaning of what the story actually is. And I think, eventually as a GM, you think that the plot thread actually has more precedence, more importance, or more significance to the player thread, the character thread. But eventually as time goes on, I feel that may not be the case anymore. I feel that the only reason why players come back to the table to play the characters that they want is because they want to explore those characters. Now, this is not to say that this applies to every player. Some players just prefer having an avatar of awesomeness rather than a character per se, in a literary sense. So they may not have any significant character traits to really go on, or maybe they're not built with those intentions. But that doesn't mean that a GM can't figure out or can't give them, if that sounds a bit dirty to you. But I think it can be developed at some point, especially in a more long term or long running sort of mode of play, like campaigns or whatnot. And I think those character traits that are derived from a player or player character are probably more interesting to players, and maybe more challenging for GMs, at least in my experience. It's that you have to figure out, like, what is it exactly that makes the character tick, and what do they perceive as reward, and what do they perceive as punishment, and what do they perceive as development, or something that's interesting that happens to a character, rather than going along the rails set by the game master. And I hope rails doesn't come up as a future topic, because I don't want to lose my thoughts on rails in a few if I had to talk about them right now. But in any case, I think that's an interesting distinction where a GM makes rails and the players make threads, and it's about the GM trying to figure out what the threads are, where the threads are, and how they can pull the threads in different directions, and hopefully the natural conclusion, and probably the satisfying conclusion for both GM and player, is to cut off or tie up any loose threads of their characters or of the plot. Just to go on a tangent a little bit, especially for the rest of this video, I would say, is that this is something that I've done quite recently. I've pretty much tied up a loose thread of a player character in my current Expedition to the Demon Web Pits campaign. It was a sorcerer who has questions about the origins of his powers, and he has a background of an inferiority complex, not being as powerful as he thinks he is, and not having the talents to prove himself otherwise to his clan. And it was a threat that has been long standing there for for a major portion of the campaign, because the campaign was not about exploring those threats. And eventually, when we decided to run expedition to the Demon Web Pits, I figured that this is actually at the request of the player, that he would like to further explore this character trait of his. And I figured, now it's the perfect time to tie it up, and I wouldn't have changed the adventure, or at least added and removed different bits and pieces about the adventure of it, if I hadn't taken his character trait into consideration, and we just concluded that particular trait, in our last session. So I was actually pretty satisfied about it, and it seems my players are actually quite happy about it. There are definitely still places that this trait can go, and that's something that I will be taking into consideration as I plan, the future sessions of the campaign. I feel players are more appreciative if you think about the trait that they set out to, and there are definitely ways that players can give threats to the GM, just outright telling them on a meta game level, or outside the session, or even being willing to invest in creating a character that has threat potential, potential threats. It could be a missing family member, or one of the cliche tropes. It could be a certain motivation that drives the players, and the GM being able to take those motivations to create something, to create a whole rail out of it. Just coming back to the idea of threats versus rails, pardon for this rest of the video. I think it's interesting because threat gives you the idea that everything is flexible. Like, you can always change a thread, but you can't change a rail. Once the rail is set down, it pretty much has to go a certain way. But threads can be pulled, can be tangled up with other threads. It can go in different directions that the initial thread may have initially thought itself is going. It can be stitched together into different canvases, and it will be different places where it wasn't expecting to. Ideally, the thread would be ended in a way where it's satisfying for both player and GM. Ideally for both, but I think at the very least I would try to still at least try to end the thread on a place, or cut the thread loose on a place where the players finds gratification for what they wanted, or where it ended. So I guess that's all I can really think about threads as of this video. I may have different ideas that I want to eventually think about it in the future, but I guess that'll be all for day 3 of RPG a Day threads.